Tea started as another formal session, another predictable appearance, another chance to repeat the same talking points. The liaison committee room was calm, quiet and orderly. No shouting, no chaos. But beneath that calm surface, something dangerous was waiting. Because this time, the questions were different. This time, the facts were lined up. And this time, Keir Starmer was not ready for what came next. Within minutes, his tax claims began to unravel live on television, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left to hide. Britain was watching a leader lose control as slowly, painfully, and in full public view. Keir Starmer entered the committee with the posture of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid. His advisors had prepared him carefully. His statements on tax had been repeated countless times before. He had said the same lines in interviews, speeches, and campaign events. That consistency had protected him until now, because consistency only works when the facts support it. And on this day, the facts were waiting on the table. The first questions were polite, almost routine. Committee members asked him to restate his position on taxation, particularly the promises made to voters about not increasing certain taxes. Starmer responded confidently, repeating the familiar phrases about fairness, responsibility and protecting working families. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then the follow-up questions began. A committee member calmly referenced an earlier statement Starmer had made months before. The wording was read out clearly, slowly, then another statement was introduced, this one more recent. The difference was subtle, but it was there. The room felt tighter. Starmer shifted slightly in his chair. He attempted to explain the difference by talking about changed circumstances. It was a phrase he had used before, one that usually ended the discussion, but this time it didn't work. The committee asked him to be specific. What circumstances had changed? When exactly did they change? And how did that justify breaking a promise made so clearly to the public? The questions were calm but relentless. Starmer paused. For the first time, his answer lacked structure. He spoke longer but said less. As the exchange continued, documents were referenced. Budget outlines, policy summaries, public commitments. Each one was already known, already public, already recorded. There was nothing secret being revealed. And that was the most damaging part. This was not an ambush. This was accountability. And under that pressure, Starmer's tax narrative began to collapse. Viewers watching live could sense the discomfort. His voice, once steady, began to tighten. He leaned back, then forward, then back again. He avoided giving direct numbers. Instead, he spoke in general terms, hoping to blur the edges, but the committee did not let him. They returned to the same core question again and again. Did you promise not to raise these taxes, and are you now planning to do so? It was a simple question, and yet it remained unanswered. This was the moment where humiliation began to replace authority, because the public does not expect perfection, but it does expect honesty. And when a leader cannot clearly explain his own tax position, doubts grow fast. Social media clips began circulating even before the session ended. People replayed the pauses, they highlighted the contradictions. The phrase tax lies started appearing in comments, then in trending topics. What was once a policy discussion was turning into a credibility crisis. Inside the committee room, the atmosphere had changed completely. The polite tone remained, but the tension was unmistakable. Starmer was no longer leading the conversation. He was reacting to it. Each answer felt defensive. Each clarification created more confusion. Committee members didn't accuse him of lying outright. They didn't need to. They simply let his own words speak against each other. As the session went on, one exchange became particularly damaging. Starmer was reminded of a clear, unambiguous promise made directly to voters. The wording left no room for interpretation. When asked whether that promise still stood, he hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough for headlines, enough for clips. Enough for the narrative to shift from policy debate to public humiliation. By the time the committee session ended, the damage was already irreversible. This was no longer about tax rates or economic strategy. It was about trust. And trust, once broken on live television, cannot be repaired quietly. The image of a confident leader had been replaced by that of a politician struggling to defend his own record. and Britain had seen it all. The humiliation did not end when the liaison committee session paused. In many ways, that was only the beginning. As Keir Starmer left the room, the damage was already spreading far beyond Westminster. Television channels cut immediately to analysis. Political correspondents used one word again and again: collapse. Not stumble, not confusion, collapse. Because what had happened was not a minor slip over figures. It was a public unravelling of a story that had been carefully sold to voters for months. Inside Labour headquarters, the reaction was sharp and urgent. Senior figures gathered quickly, some angry, others stunned. The problem was not just that Starmer had struggled under questioning. The problem was that the questioning had been basic. No traps, no tricks, just simple comparisons between what he had promised and what he was now proposing. That simplicity made the moment lethal. If he could not defend his tax position there under controlled conditions, how would he survive an election campaign? Phones rang constantly. Advisors tried to understand where the preparation had failed. Had briefing notes been wrong? Had Starmer misunderstood his own policy? Or had the party deliberately allowed a gap to exist between promises and reality? No one had clear answers, and the lack of answers only deepened the sense of crisis for a party that claimed to stand for honesty and transparency. This moment felt devastating. Meanwhile, clips from the committee session exploded online. Short videos showing Starmer hesitating, avoiding numbers, and repeating vague phrases were shared thousands of times within minutes. Viewers slowed them down, added captions, and compared them to earlier campaign speeches. The contradictions were no longer theoretical, they were visual. You could see them, you could hear them, and once that happens, damage control becomes nearly impossible. Political commentators did not hold back. Some who had previously defended Starmer now openly questioned his credibility. Others warned that this moment would follow him for the rest of his leadership. The phrase tax lies was no longer confined to social media. It appeared in opinion columns, panel discussions, and radio debates. The narrative had hardened fast. This was not about interpretation. It was about trust collapsing under scrutiny. Opposition figures moved quickly, sensing blood in the water. Statements were released demanding clarity, accountability, and explanations. Some stopped just short of calling for resignation, while others went further, arguing that a leader who could not be honest about taxes could not be trusted with the country's finances. The pressure began to feel relentless. Every hour brought a new headline, a new clip, a new angle. Even within Labour, discomfort became impossible to hide. Backbenchers were asked to defend the performance, and many struggled. Some avoided interviews altogether. Others repeated carefully worded lines about complex policy discussions, but those lines sounded weak against the clear footage playing everywhere. The party's unity began to crack, not publicly, but visibly. Silence can be as damaging as rebellion, and silence was spreading. For the public, the moment struck a nerve. Taxes are not abstract. They affect paychecks, bills, and daily life. When voters believe they have been misled on such a core issue, anger builds quickly. Call-in shows were flooded. Comment sections burned with frustration. People asked the same question again and again. If he wasn't honest about this, what else isn't he being honest about? As the day progressed, the sense grew that this was no longer just a bad performance. It was a turning point. The liaison committee had done what opposition attacks could not. It had stripped away rehearsed lines and exposed uncertainty underneath. Keir Starmer's authority had taken a visible hit, and everyone could feel it. The ground beneath his leadership was no longer stable. It was shifting, cracking, and threatening to give way entirely. As the political fallout intensified, the focus shifted from the committee room to the wider consequences for Keir Starmer's leadership. What had looked like a single bad session now felt like the moment everything finally caught up with him. Senior journalists began using harsher language. This was no longer described as confusion or miscommunication. It was being framed as exposure. The idea that Starmer had carefully avoided direct answers on tax was no longer debated. It was treated as established fact. Behind the scenes, Labour MPs were feeling the pressure from their own constituencies. Messages poured in from voters asking for explanations. Local party offices struggled to respond. Many MPs admitted privately that they had relied on the same tax assurances Starmer had repeated publicly. Now, those assurances looked unreliable. The anger was not just aimed at the leader. It spread through the party, creating fear that the damage would not stay contained at the top. Television studios filled with experts analysing every detail of the liaison committee exchange. They replayed moments where Starmer had been asked for simple clarity and failed to deliver it. Analysts pointed out that he had multiple chances to correct himself, to give a straight answer, to reset the narrative. Each time he chose careful language instead. That choice now looked like avoidance. And in politics, avoidance is often interpreted as guilt. Public trust began to erode at speed. Polling experts warned that tax credibility is one of the hardest things to recover once lost. Voters might forgive mistakes, but they rarely forgive being misled about money. The sense that Starmer had said one thing and prepared to do another cut deep. For many watching, this felt personal. It wasn't about ideology, it was about honesty. Social media continued to amplify the damage. Influential commentators shared side-by-side comparisons of Starmer's past promises and his committee answers. The contrast was stark. The clips didn't need commentary, they spoke for themselves. Every share widened the reach. Every reaction hardened opinions. Attempts by party figures to push alternative narratives were drowned out almost instantly. Inside Westminster, the mood turned darker. Some MPs reportedly began discussing leadership scenarios quietly, not openly, not officially, but the conversations had started. When a leader becomes a liability rather than an asset, politics moves fast. No one wanted to be caught unprepared if the situation escalated further. The liaison committee humiliation had created momentum, and momentum in politics is dangerous once it turns against you. Starmer's own appearances became more limited. When he did speak, his words were cautious and tightly controlled. But the more controlled he sounded, the less convincing it felt. Reporters pressed him harder. They returned again and again to the same issue: tax promises and broken trust. No matter how he tried to shift the conversation, it kept snapping back to that moment in the committee room. What made this phase so damaging was the sense of inevitability. The story no longer felt like it could be reversed with one strong speech or one clarification. It had moved beyond that. The humiliation had become symbolic, a representation of a wider problem. A leader who prided himself on discipline had been undone by basic scrutiny, and that image was sticking. By the end of the day, the question dominating political discussion was no longer whether Starmer had performed badly. It was whether he could recover at all. The liaison committee session had stripped away protection, and now he stood exposed to every challenge ahead. The pressure was building, the silence from allies was growing, and the sense of collapse was becoming harder to ignore. As pressure mounted, the atmosphere around Keir Starmer changed noticeably. This was no longer a momentary storm that advisors believed could be waited out. It felt structural. Every appearance, every statement, every sequence now carried weight. The humiliation at the liaison committee had created a new lens through which everything he said was viewed. Even neutral remarks were questioned. Even unrelated policies were dragged back to the issue of trust. Inside Labour, frustration began to surface more openly. Some MPs stopped using his name in interviews, referring instead to the leadership or the party position. That distancing was subtle but telling. It suggested uncertainty, not loyalty. Others privately admitted they were struggling on the doorstep. Voters were not asking about long-term visions or abstract reforms. They were asking one thing. Why did he say one thing about taxes and then refuse to repeat it under scrutiny? Senior party figures attempted damage control. Carefully timed briefings appeared, insisting that there had been no change in policy, only confusion in presentation. But those briefings clashed with the footage everyone had already seen. In politics, perception often outweighs explanation, and the perception was clear. The leader had been pressed and he had folded. No amount of spin could fully reverse that impression. Media scrutiny intensified further. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into past speeches, as interviews and policy documents. Every inconsistency was flagged. Every ambiguous phrase was re-examined. The liaison committee session had opened the door, and now reporters were walking straight through it. Stories multiplied, each one reinforcing the idea that the truth had been carefully managed, not clearly stated. The tone of coverage shifted from analysis to judgment. Headlines grew sharper, panel discussions grew harsher. Commentators who once praised Starmer's professionalism now questioned whether that professionalism had masked a lack of honesty. The phrase credibility gap appeared again and again, and once that phrase takes hold, it is extremely difficult to escape. Public reaction continued to harden. Pollsters reported early signs of declining confidence, particularly among voters who valued fiscal responsibility. For them, the issue was not political theatre, it was about trust in leadership. When that trust cracks, it rarely repairs quickly. The liaison committee humiliation had become shorthand for doubt, a reference point repeated across conversations. Even Starmer's allies struggled to mount a convincing defence. Some tried to argue that the questioning had been unfair. Others suggested the media was exaggerating the moment. But these arguments failed to gain traction. The footage was too clear, the hesitation too obvious, the avoidance too visible. People had made up their minds based on what they saw, not what they were told. As days passed, the sense of isolation around the leadership grew. Meetings were held, strategies were discussed. But the core problem remained unresolved. How do you rebuild trust once people believe you have misled them? There was no easy answer. And without an answer, uncertainty filled the space. What made this phase particularly dangerous was the slow erosion of authority. There was no dramatic announcement, no immediate collapse. Instead, confidence drained quietly. Allies hesitated. Critics grew bolder. The liaison committee moment lingered like a shadow over every decision, and with each passing hour, the question became louder. Even if it was not yet spoken openly, how long can this last? By this stage, the crisis was no longer contained within party walls or media studios. It had reached the point where silence itself became dangerous. Every hour without a clear, direct explanation only deepened suspicion. For Keir Starmer, the problem was not just what he had said at the liaison committee. It was what he had not said. The unanswered questions were now louder than any statement he could issue. Pressure from within Labour intensified. Senior MPs, once cautious, began urging clarity behind closed doors. Some warned that the longer this dragged on, the more permanent the damage would become. Elections are not only about policies, they are about belief, and belief was slipping away fast. The fear was simple but brutal. Voters might stop listening altogether. Strategists debated possible responses. One option was a full reset. A detailed speech laying out tax policy line by line, while acknowledging mistakes and attempting to rebuild trust. Another was to hold the line, insist nothing had changed, and hope the storm would pass. But hope is not a strategy, and many inside the party knew it. The liaison committee humiliation had given critics a fixed reference point. No future message could erase that image completely. Opposition attacks sharpened. Questions were repeated relentlessly in Parliament and interviews. Why did the answers change? Why avoid numbers? Why refuse to commit clearly when previously there had been confidence? Each repetition reinforced the narrative. Even neutral observers began to describe the situation as unsustainable. A leader cannot lead effectively while constantly explaining the past. Public fatigue began to show. People were not just angry, they were tired. Tired of vague language, tired of careful phrasing, tired of feeling managed. That fatigue is dangerous in politics because it turns disengagement into rejection. When voters stop arguing and start switching off, recovery becomes nearly impossible. The humiliation at the liaison committee had now transformed into something larger, a symbol of mistrust. It was referenced in debates about leadership, honesty, and accountability. It became shorthand for doubt. And symbols once established are incredibly powerful. They outlive explanations and survive apologies. Even attempts to shift focus failed. New policy announcements struggled to gain attention. Media coverage dragged everything back to the same core issue: trust, taxes, truth. The gravitational pull of the controversy was too strong. It swallowed everything around it. For Starmer, there was no clean escape route. Inside the leadership team, morale reportedly dropped. Advisors who once spoke with confidence now spoke cautiously. Meetings became tense. Decisions were delayed. Every move was weighed against how it might be interpreted through the lens of the liaison committee collapse. Leadership paralysis is subtle, but its effects are immediate. What made this moment especially critical was timing. With political stakes rising, opponents sensed vulnerability, allies sensed risk, and voters sensed uncertainty. In politics, uncertainty is lethal. It invites challenge, it invites doubt, and it invites the question that now hovered uncomfortably close, even if few dared to say it aloud: is this leadership still viable?